On March 11th, 1859, Anne Belansky's husband, Stanislaus Belansky, died, and his wife was accused of murder. Her trial and execution made executions more humane and eventually gave the right to live to all criminals throughout Minnesota. This trial was also a turning point in the government's responsibility to make the right conviction. This is the trial of Anne Belansky. This is capital punishment.
Capital punishment has existed and been evolving for a long time. For instance, in the 1600s, in the United States, it was possible to get the death penalty for stealing grapes or trading with the Indians, but executions were rare in the Midwest. But in 1846, Michigan went a step farther and became the first Western government in the world to abolish the death penalty. Minnesotans had always been uncomfortable with the death penalty for a large part of their history because it was often weighed on their morals. They felt an eye for an eye wasn't right. Although they didn't show as much compassion to the Indians, who were executed without evidence and without representation. Alexander Ramsey was the first territorial governor and played a large role in negotiating treaties with the Dakota. However, he was also a large supporter of the death penalty. In addition, he played a large role in the trial of Anne Belansky. Anne Belansky lived in Fayetteville, North Carolina, until she moved with her nephew, John Walker, to Illinois. In April 1858, Anne Belansky moved to Minnesota from Pleasant Hill, Illinois, at the request from her nephew, John Walker. She then married Stanislaus Belansky. When in 1858, Mr. Belansky went on a hunting trip in December and he came back sick. He recovered, but in February 1859, he fell ill again, this time not to recover, and on March 11, 1859, he died. An investigation into his death revealed nothing until a testimony given by the Belansky's neighbor put his wife behind bars. Lucinda Kilpatrick testified that 2 weeks before Mr. Belansky's death, she and Anne took a little shopping trip. The shopping trip was to Dan Jenks' drugstore, where Mrs. Belansky bought arsenic, saying it was to kill rats. There wasn't much evidence there, but it was enough to charge Anne with murder. Mrs. Belansky was given the lawyer John B. Brispin. The prosecution attorney was Isaac Hurd. Jury selection went quickly and the trial began. Isaac Hurd started the opening arguments. In them, he described 3 crucial pieces of evidence that made up the prosecution's case. The first one was Lucinda Kilpatrick's testimony that Anne had bought the arsenic at the drugstore to kill Mr. Belansky. Another one was that she was having an affair with John Walker, her supposed nephew, who lived in a shack behind the Belansky's house. Third was that Anne had talked with Lucinda and others about situations with her husband being mysteriously gone, or other scenarios.
According to the prosecution, based on these 3 pieces of evidence, Anne was contemplating murder. There were supposed to be 6 tests done on the body of Mr. Belansky testing for arsenic. 1 out of the 5 tests that were performed was positive for arsenic, as one of the tests was not performed. The next step of the trial led the prosecution to uncover Anne Belansky's motive. They believed that her motive was that she was having an affair with her nephew John Walker. Around this time, John B. Brispin fell ill, and yet the trial was not stopped. His illness was so severe that for several days he could not speak in front of the jury. This was important because it seems for the entirety of the trial, Brispin's main tactic was not to challenge the facts, except the ones that proved that she was guilty, but to challenge the people who gave the evidence and that they were not trustworthy enough. An example of this was when he was attacking the prosecution for the fact that why had Mr. Belansky been sick for nearly 2 weeks, when enough arsenic was found in his stomach to cause death within 30 minutes. These were some biases that we found in the trial. Others were that the doctor who did the tests for arsenic under cross-examination said he didn't really apply himself to chemistry. Another one was that the jury was allowed to go into the public, and many of the people there wanted Anne dead. One last piece of bias is that after Anne was finally convicted of murder and sentenced to death, Alexander Ramsay would not pardon her, even though many people signed petitions to let her live after the result of the trial. However, a lot of people say that this happened because Alexander Ramsay's brother and partner in business was on the jury that found her guilty. Many people later saw these biases and faulty evidence, such as the prosecution attorney Isaac Hurd. He wrote in a letter to Alexander Ramsay that he had grave and serious doubts as to whether the defendant has had a fair trial, but not for the jury that found her guilty.
From the evidence and bias in the trial, Mrs. Wolanski was eventually convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death. On March 23, 1860, after several attempts for a retry, Anne Wolanski was hanged. However, she had a lasting impact on criminal justice and overall the people of Minnesota. One major impact was that her trial had a significant role in the passing of the John Day Smith Law in Minnesota on April 24, 1889. This law prohibited any execution in the daytime hours or any execution covered by the news media. The reason they passed this was the public was so appalled from her execution, where she told her captors, "I'm ready to die, but do not let my death be a spectacle." This law was broken during the execution of William Williams, where his hanging rope was too long, and he hit the floor and was strangled to death for 14 minutes before he was pronounced dead. Despite the John Day Smith Law, this was made public, which helped the abolition of the death penalty. An expert, Steve Kaplan from Frederickson and Byron, agreed with our conclusions.
Probably it did. We went from having in Minnesota public hangings that took place out in a public square or on the street corner, and you'll see photographs of very well-dressed and large crowds that would pose for pictures with the executed deceased body hanging in the background from the scaffold.
Steve Kaplan also told us why he thinks the Minnesota legislature abolished the death penalty.
It probably helped bring about the abolition in 1911. And my study of the history of the death penalty tells me that, in Minnesota, tells me that it was public revulsion at the death penalty because of what had happened in this particular case, and later with the very famous botched execution of William Williams.
There are still some biases today, like racial discrimination or gender bias, affecting how we treat criminals. Overall, Anne's trial had a deeper impact on Minnesota than just her execution. It affected the way that we treat criminals and how we give them trials. It gave the idea to other states that the death penalty is not necessary. Her trial affected not only Minnesota, but the whole United States, saving hundreds of lives from people who would otherwise be killed without the death penalty. Since the trial, 14 states have abolished the death penalty, and others are thinking about it. The argument for capital punishment is that how can you punish someone without taking a life if they haven't taken a life of others? It's just not a fair punishment. The argument against the death penalty is that an eye for an eye is not the way our justice system should work, and that if we do not like killing, why should the government do it? Her trial helped spark this very debate. This is why we chose this trial. It affects everyone.